When you say Dennis Rodman, most people think of the same thing: the neon green hair, the endless nights in Las Vegas, the piercings, the eccentricities. For some, he's just a media clown, but that's just the surface. Behind the costume, there was a player who could tear a game apart without scoring a single point. Rodman was a living paradox, a guy who seemed to live against all the rules, but who on the court was pure discipline, a rebel who showed up late, skipped practices, and asked for vacations in the middle of the playoff. And yet, every time he stepped on the hardwood, he disrupted the game in his favor. How do you explain that someone who averaged barely 7 points per game ends up being considered one of the most influential players in NBA history? How good was Dennis Rodman, really? Dennis Rodman was never a chosen one. He wasn't even a prospect. In his Dallas high school, he didn't make the main team because he was barely 5 feet 11 inches, 1.80 meters, and had a skinny, awkward body. To the coaches, he was irrelevant, just another filler not even worth looking at. While other kids dreamed of college scholarships, Rodman worked wherever he could, lost in the routine. His family was broken, his father had abandoned them when he was 3, and his mother spent her life working to support Dennis and his 2 sisters. He himself admitted he was a lost cause, a kid with no direction, wandering the streets of Dallas not knowing what to do with his life. He had no interest in school, no standout skills. Basically, no one would have bet a cent on him. His lowest point came when he was working as a janitor at the Dallas airport. He stole 15 watches from a store, got arrested, and his mother, fed up, kicked him out of the house. Literally, at 19, he was alone, homeless, with no future and no basketball. If he kept going down that path, it was more likely he'd end up in jail or dead than on a professional court. And yet right in the middle of that void, something cosmic happened. Between the ages of 19 and 20, he had an absurd growth spurt, more than 8 inches, 20 centimeters in less than a year. He went from being a skinny 5 feet 11 inches to a 6 feet 7 inches, 2.01 meters, giant. He had no technique, no fundamentals, but suddenly he had size. And that transformation was the first spark that pulled him out of the darkness. He still wasn't a basketball player, but at least he was visible again. The growth spurt changed everything, but it wasn't a magic ticket to the NBA. Even after hitting 2 meters tall, Rodman was still a nobody. He hadn't played organized basketball in high school. He had no technique and no platform to showcase the little he knew how to do, but he started showing up on small courts around Dallas in neighborhood games where the only thing he did was fight for every rebound like his life depended on it, and in a way, it did. His life was on the line. That instinct caught the attention of some lower league coaches, and from there came the most improbable opportunity of all. Lon Reisman, a coach from southeastern Oklahoma State, a university lost in the middle of nowhere in the NAIA division, saw him at an amateur tournament and decided to offer him a scholarship. For anyone dreaming of the NBA, that scholarship was almost a joke. The NAIA was a very low level, less competitive than New York playgrounds, but for Rodman, it was the first open door in his entire life. There he exploded. Instead of being just another player, he dominated. He scored 25 points per game, sure, but what really stood out were his rebounding numbers. He led the entire division with averages of 16 and even 18 rebounds per game. He threw himself on the floor, dove into the stands, chased the ball like it was oxygen. In a setting where most played for fun, he played like it was the NBA Finals. That hunger, mixed with his new physique and endless energy, finally caught the attention of an NBA team, the Detroit Pistons. In 1986, they selected him in the draft with the 27th pick when he was already 25 years old. Late for a rookie, old for a prospect. But Dennis Rodman, the same guy who just a few years earlier had been cleaning bathrooms at an airport, was entering the toughest league in the world. What no one imagined at that moment was that he wouldn't just survive, he was going to change the way rebounding and defense were understood in modern basketball. If there was one place where Rodman could fit in, it was Detroit. The Pistons of the 80s weren't a basketball team, they were a gang in jerseys. They were called the Bad Boys because they played hard, on the edge, with fouls that today would mean an automatic ejection. The message was simple: if you wanted to beat them, you had to survive them first. For Rodman, it was like finding a twisted family, but a family nonetheless. Isaiah Thomas, Joe DeMars, Bill Laimbeer, and above all, Coach Chuck Daly adopted him as one of their own. Daly became the father figure he never had. Chuck was the father I was missing. He would later admit what they asked of him was clear: play with your heart on your sleeve and don't give up an inch, and Dennis followed it to the letter. He was tireless. While other players saved energy for offense, Rodman poured his soul into every defensive play. He dove on the floor, collided with giants, ran the full court to contest a shot. He had so much fuel that after games, he would get on a stationary bike or Stairmaster for another hour. This was a guy who used to work as a janitor and now treated every rebound like he was still fighting to escape the streets. The Pistons became a machine. In 1988, they reached the finals but lost to the Lakers in 7 games. The following year, they swept Magic Johnson's Lakers and took the title. In 1990, they repeated against Portland, with Rodman becoming more and more important in the rotation. His intensity was so contagious that at times it felt like he alone set the tone for the entire team. He wasn't an elegant player. He didn't use fakes, didn't have a shot, didn't aim to shine, but he was the first to fight with Jordan, to guard the rival point guard or the biggest center, to throw his body where no one else dared. The NBA recognized him with 2 consecutive Defensive Player of the Year awards in 1990 and 1991. The Bad Boys had stars and they had talent, but with Rodman, they found a warrior spirit. He was the perfect soldier for a team that understood basketball in that era could also be won by force. Rodman wasn't just effort and lungs, he had an obsession that made him unique: rebounding. For him, going after the ball wasn't instinct, it was a study, a personal laboratory. While others practiced shots or offensive plays, Rodman stayed alone on the court watching how the ball bounced off the rim. He started to notice that each shooter left a signature. Larry Bird's spin made the ball rotate a certain way, Magic's shots had a different drop, Jordan's bounced off at different angles. So he began to mentally map out where each ball would end up depending on who shot it. He explained it himself: if Bird shot, the ball would spin a certain way. If Magic did, it bounced differently. I placed myself where I knew it would land. That wasn't luck, it was calculation. While everyone else thought rebounding was just effort, Rodman turned it into applied science. The result was insane. From 1992 to 1998, he led the NBA in rebounds for 7 straight seasons with averages over 16 per game. And the most incredible part, all those titles came after he turned 30. In a sport where most players begin to decline, he became a machine. He wasn't 7 feet 1 inch like the dominant centers, nor did he weigh 285 pounds. He was just a 6'7", 220-pound forward, but he understood angles better than anyone. He had the timing, the reading of the play, and the will to throw himself against anything. More than a rebounder, he was a trajectory hunter. That's why he could finish games with 0 points and 20 rebounds and still be the most impactful player on the court. He had reinvented an aspect of the game that most took for granted and turned it into his own form of art. The romance with Detroit wasn't going to last forever. The Bad Boys were starting to age, and after getting swept by the Bulls in 1991, it was clear the dynasty was coming to an end. But for Rodman, the hardest blow wasn't losing on the court, it was off it. Chuck Daly, the man who had been like a father to him, resigned in 1992. That absence completely destabilized him. Without Daly, Rodman was adrift. In 1993, he hit rock bottom. He showed up in the parking lot of the Palace of Auburn Hills with a shotgun in his car, ready to end his life. He was found by Craig Sager, the TNT reporter, who managed to talk to him and convince him to put the gun down. That night, instead of an ending, marked the beginning of a transformation. What followed was a dark rebirth. Rodman decided he would no longer hide who he was or how he felt. Tattoos began to cover his body, piercings multiplied, his hairstyle and clothes changed. He went from being the shy, quiet kid who followed orders to a persona that challenged everything the NBA stood for, as if, in order to survive, he had to invent a new skin. On the court, he was still a beast, but off it, the new Rodman was an explosive cocktail. Bars, alcohol, fights with executives, and a reputation that made him increasingly hard to manage. Detroit was no longer his place, and he knew it. He would request a trade, and his story with the Pistons, where he had won 2 titles and 2 Defensive Player of the Year awards, would end in a turbulent farewell marked more by personal crisis than applause. It was the beginning of a phase where Rodman's talent would reach its peak. At the same time, his personal life became a constant firestorm. When Rodman landed with the San Antonio Spurs in 1993, he brought 2 things with him: uncontrollable talent and a chaos that was just beginning to take shape. On the court, the impact was immediate. Alongside David Robinson, he formed one of the most feared defensive duos in the league. Robinson was military discipline, the admiral trained by the Navy. Rodman, the hurricane that answered to no one and nothing. That combination, though lethal in numbers, never quite clicked in spirit. In just 2 seasons with the Spurs, Rodman tore the NBA apart from one angle: rebounding. In 1993 to 94, he averaged 17.3. The following year, 16.8. He led the league, and not just once. This was the beginning of a 7-year streak of rebounding titles that would put him in the history books. He was a show all by himself. It didn't matter if they were up against Shaq, Olajuwon, or Ewing. Rodman found a way to beat them to position, dive headfirst, and come down with the ball. But what happened off the court was another story. story. Rodman was starting to become a persona that overwhelmed the Spurs. He showed up late to practices, dyed his hair a different color every week, racked up suspensions, and had no filter when speaking about coaches or executives. After losing to the Rockets in the 1995 playoffs, he publicly blamed coach Bob Hill, calling him a loser for not having a serious defensive plan. That day, his future in Texas was sealed. While Robinson was the image of the ideal athlete, Rodman was showing up on magazine covers with fluorescent hairstyles, fresh tattoos, and nightlife exploits that turned into headlines. San Antonio wasn't ready for someone like him. They wanted his rebounding, yes, but not the constant firestorm that came with it. In the end, the Spurs won 62 games in 1995, with Robinson as MVP and Rodman dominating the boards. But that was the peak. The playoff loss to Houston and the open war with the coaching staff ended with him out. Around the league, Rodman was already seen as a radioactive player, too good to ignore, too explosive to want around. What no one expected was that right at that moment, in the 1995-96 season, the most successful team on the planet would decide to play the riskiest card of all. When the Bulls called him, Rodman was closer to being pushed out of the NBA than to adding more titles. His reputation was that of an unmanageable player, suspended, fined, and always in the headlines more for what he did off the court than for his game. But Phil Jackson, who had a sixth sense for reading rebellious souls, took a chance on him. And Jordan and Pippen, who had suffered Rodman firsthand when he was in Detroit, ended up accepting the idea if anyone could tame the worm, it was them. The first meeting was almost like a movie scene. Rodman showed up at Jerry Krause's house with his hat pulled down over his eyes, nose rings, and didn't even stand up to greet anyone. Phil Jackson stared at him and asked him to take off his hat and shake hands. That was the first gesture of discipline. From there, a strange pact was born. Dennis could be a circus off the court as long as he gave 110% on it. And he delivered. In 1996, with him on the team, the Bulls achieved the legendary 72-win season. In those finals against Seattle, Rodman grabbed 11 offensive rebounds in 2 different games. An absurd stat for a championship series. George Karl, coach of the Sonics, didn't mince words. Rodman won us 2 games by himself. What's incredible is that he did it his way. He skipped scouting meetings, showed up late to practices, and more than once arrived minutes before tip-off eating chicken and rice like nothing was happening, but everyone knew that once the ball went up, Rodman was going to give his life for every rebound. It was a strange but effective code. The chaos off the court was allowed because on it, he was perfection. The most legendary story is the one in Las Vegas. In the middle of the season, Rodman asked Phil for a vacation. A vacation during the NBA season? Jackson, with that trademark Zen calm, allowed it. 48 hours. Rodman hopped on a plane to Vegas and disappeared. Parties, hotels, Carmen Electra, total madness. The 48 hours passed, nothing. More days passed, still nothing. In the end, Michael Jordan himself had to go find him, knock on his hotel room door, and drag him out of bed back to Chicago. And yet, when he returned, Rodman didn't let them down. He never left the team hanging when it mattered. He could live on the edge, but in the playoffs, he was locked in. In the 1997 and 1998 finals, he became Karl Malone's shadow, harassing him, hitting him, provoking him, pushing him to the brink of madness. On the court, he drove him crazy. Off the court, he mocked him, even taking the rivalry to pro wrestling, appearing in the ring with Hulk Hogan in the summer of '98, just a day before playing NBA Finals games. That was the impossible balance the Bulls managed with Rodman, a guy who seemed to play against all the rules of the sport, but who, at the same time, understood better than anyone the role he had to play. He never wanted to be a star, never looked to score more than he had to. He knew his place was in the mud, in the sacrifice, in the battles that don't make the highlights. And that commitment was the glue that allowed Chicago to build Jordan's second great dynasty, because the truth is, without Rodman, the Bulls would have been a great team. With him, they became immortal. Talking about Dennis Rodman in the abstract isn't enough. What really shows who he was on the court are the testimonies of those who faced him and played alongside him. Because when they describe him, they don't just talk about rebounds, they talk about a physical phenomenon impossible to box in. Kevin Garnett, who wasn't one to hand out compliments lightly, put it bluntly. Rodman could play in any era. He compared him to Draymond Green, but with more control and more physicality. Rodman stood 2.01 meters tall, but moved like a 1.85 meter point guard. Garnett said the Worm wasn't afraid of switching defensive assignments. If he had to guard a shooting guard, he did it. If he had to collide with a 130-kilo center, he did that too. And the most impressive part was that he did it with pleasure, as if he enjoyed the pain of contact. Shaquille O'Neal always tells the same story. Rodman showing up late to the locker room, plate of rice and chicken in hand, not warming up or looking at anyone. Nobody dared to call him out because they knew what came next. He would step on the court and grab 20 or 25 rebounds like it was nothing. For Shaq, who faced him down low, Rodman was a phenomenal athlete. athlete, one of the few who could physically match him. Even more, Shaq admitted with some resentment that Rodman had something neither he nor Kobe had at that time, that inexplicable magnetism around him on and off the court. David Robinson, who was his teammate in San Antonio, described him almost in disbelief. He was like Superman. He ran all day, never got tired, like the Energizer Bunny. Having him by your side meant you had a warrior with you. And Robinson, who hated his eccentricities, couldn't deny that on the court, Rodman was a reliable ally. Steve Kerr saw it differently. In Chicago, he remembered practices called Indian runs. The idea was to jog lightly and save your legs. Rodman didn't get it. When it was his turn to lead, he would sprint like it was an Olympic final. The rest of the team needed 4 full laps to catch him. It wasn't just endurance, it was a compulsion to push the limit further. Reggie Miller, who crossed paths with him countless times, said he saw Rodman dominate Chicago's nightlife, and the next day dominate the court with the same energy. Party animal to the extreme, but on the court, he played even harder. It was as if normal laws, rest, fatigue, hangovers, didn't apply to him. And Sean Kemp, after losing the 1996 finals, admitted bluntly, Michael wasn't the one who beat us, it was Rodman. We had no answer for him. When a Jordan rival says that at the peak of number 23's career, it speaks volumes about how monstrous Rodman was in that series. In a sport ruled by height and scoring, Rodman proved you could be a giant in another way. Too quick for a big man, too strong for a small one, too tough for anyone. And that combination made him an eternal nightmare for those who tried to face him, and a teammate who gave the peace of mind that the dirty work would always be done. If rebounding was his science, chaos was his art. Rodman understood that basketball wasn't played only with legs and arms, but also with the mind. And he, more than anyone, knew how to get into an opponent's head and wear them down until they exploded. It wasn't unusual to see him kiss a player on the cheek, smile after a foul, or lean provocatively on an opponent. These weren't random eccentricities, they were psychological traps. Some rivals admitted it years later, recognizing that beyond his impossible rebounds, the real defeat had started in their heads. Karl Malone was the perfect example. Rodman defended him with unbearable cynicism, tugs, whispers, theatrical gestures. He reduced him to a bundle of frustration. And the most humiliating moment came in 1998 when he took that rivalry beyond the court. He appeared on WCW alongside Hulk Hogan, mocking Malone in a wrestling ring in the middle of the NBA Finals. In Seattle, Frank Brakowski also lost his cool. Rodman provoked him with colored contact lenses, painted lips, and constant acting that threw him off. The result? Brakowski racked up fouls and unnecessary anger, exactly what Dennis wanted. The pattern repeated itself. While others got distracted, Rodman stuck to his invisible script: rebound, defend, dirty the game. His show wasn't meant to shine, but to drag everyone into the mud. And in that terrain, dirty, uncomfortable, mentally exhausting, no one could beat him. Rodman was more than a defensive specialist, he was a master of mind games, an actor who turned confusion into strategy and provocation into a competitive edge. In a game where mental toughness was just as important as physical strength, that was his true secret weapon. If you look at Dennis Rodman's stat sheet, the automatic reaction is surprise or confusion. Throughout his entire career, he averaged just 7 points per game. By NBA star standards, that's ridiculous, and yet he's a Hall of Famer, a 5-time champion, and considered one of the greatest defenders in history. How do you explain that? The paradox makes sense when you look at the other numbers. Between 1992 and 1998, Rodman led the league in rebounds for 7 straight seasons, something no other player has ever done. And he did it after turning 30 when most players start to decline. There were games where he finished with 0 points and 20, 23, even 28 rebounds. For his team, those boards were worth as much as a barrage of 3-pointers. The most staggering stat lies in the advanced analytics. Rodman has the highest rebound percentage in NBA history with 23.4% of all available rebounds on the court. In plain language, for every 4 missed shots, 1 ended up in his hands. Not even Chamberlain or Russell, with all their records, reached that level. And it wasn't just a regular season trick. In the playoffs, with the pressure at its peak, Rodman remained the same. In the 1996 finals, in 2 different games, he grabbed 11 offensive rebounds. Not total rebounds, offensive, a record that still feels unreal. And in 1998, at 37 years old, he was still capable of containing Karl Malone, the league's MVP. His legacy lies in that contradiction: a player who never looked to score, who didn't have a reliable shot, who was almost invisible on offense, and yet could completely dominate a game. Rodman proved that impact isn't always measured in points, that you can be indispensable from a place almost no one values on the stat sheet. He was an anomaly, a paradox that forces us to rethink what it means to be great in basketball. Because if the measure is real impact on the game, Rodman was as decisive as any superstar. If on the court Rodman was disciplined hidden under chaos, off the court he was an unfiltered spectacle. And that media show ultimately turned him into a cultural icon of the 90s. It all started with Madonna. In the mid-90s, when he was playing in San Antonio, rumors linked him to the Queen of Pop. The relationship didn't last long, but it left a mark. Madonna encouraged Rodman to be more eccentric, more provocative, more free. And Dennis, who had already been reinventing himself after the collapse in Detroit, adopted that side as his new identity. Then came Carmen Electra, the model and actress who became his most media-covered partner. Between endless parties and getaways to Las Vegas, with the famous anecdote of Jordan knocking on his door to bring him back to Chicago, Rodman was no longer just a basketball player, he was tabloid material, magazine cover, symbol of an extravagant lifestyle. But the most unforgettable moment was the wedding dress. In 1996, Rodman showed up in New York dressed in white with makeup and a veil to promote his autobiography, Bad As I Wanna Be. The image went around the world, the fiercest rebounder in the NBA presenting himself as a bride at a full-blown media altar. There was no one else in sports who understood how to use provocation as marketing like he did. And if something was missing to complete the show, he found it in wrestling. In the summers of 1997 and 1998, while Chicago was playing in the NBA Finals, Rodman appeared in WCW alongside Hulk Hogan in full episodes of Monday Nitro. He wrestled, talked on the mic, aligned himself with the NWO villains, and the next day he was guarding Karl Malone in the paint. That mix of NBA and wrestling was a crazy sign of the times. Sports, entertainment, and reality show all embodied in one man. Rodman understood before anyone else that sports and entertainment could intersect, that a player could be a global star without scoring 30 points per game, but by becoming a character that generated headlines. On the court, he was an obsessive specialist, off it, an unpredictable rock star. Dennis Rodman was an enigma the NBA never quite managed to decipher. A man who seemed to live in absolute chaos, but who on the court was pure discipline, calculation, and commitment. A player who could disappear to Las Vegas in the middle of the playoffs and return just in time to deliver the best defensive series of the finals. What remains of him is that twisted contradiction. A guy who averaged just 7 points per game, who never sought offensive protagonism, yet still tipped the outcome of a championship. Rodman didn't need the glory of scoring to be decisive, nor the shine of the offensive show to be indispensable. His greatness lived in the invisible corners of the game, the boards, the impossible matchups, the grinding minutes that don't make the highlights, and yet at the same time, it was impossible to separate him from the persona, because that fluorescent hair, the tattoos, the provocations, and the scandals were also part of his impact. Rodman was show and sacrifice, rebellion and discipline, chaos and science, a balance so strange that only someone like him could hold it together. Maybe that's where his true paradox lies, that without the scandal, without the persona, the player might never have existed, and without the player, the persona would never have transcended. Both sides, inseparable, pushing and contradicting each other, as if all his strength was born precisely from that impossible mix. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. This was Hoop Secrets, and I'll see you next time.